It's good to see you today. Thankful we can be together today. You know, we're singing about the hope of heaven. That is our hope, and it's our hope for everybody we know. It's our hope for folks we don't know. It's the hope for every member of the congregation here. And we've been looking recently at lessons from 1 Corinthians and trying to gain some insights from this book, this letter. And one of the things that strikes us is the fact that Corinth was a very troubled church, but it was not a hopeless church. And, I realize I've got my problems, but it does give me hope to read a letter like this and to see a church that was certainly in many ways flawed, but a church that had growing to do, yes, but was a church that Paul thought was well able to overcome. It gives us hope to think about that. I think Paul's work with them, the Lord's work with them, is a great reminder of that fact. Sometimes it's a bumpy road to make it, but it's worth it. And one of the things that's essential for me is I'm going to have to be teachable. You know, that's something that we learn, don't we, from the New Testament. We're going to have to learn how to take correction and to make application and to think about ourselves in terms of how we can get better every day. And a lot of that, I think, is wrapped up in what Paul is teaching here. Now, as you notice, our ambition today is to look at the letter to 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. All these chapters are connected together, I think. Considering the pace we've been going at, that may seem like an impossible job, but we're going to try to do a better job of perhaps looking in a broader way at the lessons that are found here. But I do invite you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and we'll begin in verse 1, and we'll look and see, I think, the setting of this section and what Paul is addressing here. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, I'm reading this from the old translation. He writes, "Now, as touching things offered unto idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but charity edifies. And if any man think that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. But if any man love God, the same is known of him. As concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there is none other God but one. For though there be that are called gods, whether in heaven or in earth, as there be gods many and lords many, but to us there is but one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him." It's quite a way to begin this section here. You'll notice he starts off with this point. He says, "Now concerning things offered to idols." That sounds a lot like what we read back in the 7th chapter, "Now concerning things whereof you wrote to me." So I think this does concern questions that the Corinthians had. Back in chapter 7, they were asking the question of Paul, in effect, something like this: do we have to be unmarried to be Christians? If we're married to even lawful spouses, do we have to get rid of our lawful spouse to be a Christian? What if they're not Christians? What if the people we're married to are not Christians? Lawful spouses, but not Christians. Do we need to get rid of them in order to serve Christ? And Paul answers those questions, practical questions. Somebody might look at this question and think, well, how practical is this? Maybe it was to the Corinthians, you know. What does he mean when he talks about eating those things that are sacrificed unto idols? Was that a real problem? What does it even mean to eat something sacrificed to an idol? I think your knowledge of the Old Testament will be helpful here. You remember how that under the law of Moses, that the Jews would offer, for example, the peace offering. Not all the offerings were burned up fully upon the altar. There were whole burnt offerings that were offered in total. But with a number of the sacrifices, there would be actually a small remnant of the animal that would actually be burnt upon an altar. The rest of the animal would be divided up. Some of that would go to the officiating priest. And some of it would be eaten by the offerer. And so, the idea of partaking of a sacrifice is exactly the way it worked in many cases. The offerer would offer to God and would support God's priest, and then he would take some of that himself in a meal that suggested the idea of fellowship with God. That this sacrifice comes from me and I partake of it, and God's people partake of it, and we together share that communion. That was much the case in terms of the idolatrous offerings. And so it's interesting. This is a picture. I didn't take this picture. I've never been over there. But if you go over to Corinth, you can see in this picture, in the background, the columns of the old temple of Apollo. And then you have here these little colonnades, if you look carefully, along the roadway here. And these, I'm told, are the ancient meat markets, butcher shops. Why would you have butcher shops within rock-throwing distance of the temple? Well, because of the very thing we're talking about here. That these offerings would be overwhelming. And the priest would even take some of the offering that they had and sell that to the butcher shops, then to be sold to the general public. So if you were in Corinth, by the way, I thought this was interesting. This is a picture that Pharaoh Jenkins took on one of his trips over there back many years ago, back in the early 70s. I think this used to be on display in the local museum there, and I think they've taken it away. I don't know if you can make it out or not. But here on the top line is the large portion of the word makellum. That's the Latin for Makellus, the Greek. That's the same word that's used by Paul in the 10th chapter, in verse 25, in this same context. When he talks here in the Old King James, it calls it the shambles. Whatever you find in whatever's sold in the shambles, or the meat market, as your translation may say. Same word. So this is the kind of thing going on there. So when he's talking about this question of eating things or what to do about meat sacrificed to idols, it was a very practical question to these people, because it would be just everywhere. It'd be very difficult to find meat that was perhaps not sacrificed to idols. It was so common in Corinth. So what do you do about that? As a Christian, how do you approach such a question? Well, one thing that Paul says is we certainly have knowledge, and there are things that we know. We know, for example, as he goes on to explain, that an idol is nothing, and that's right. There is no Apollo. And this is all just a part of somebody's fantasy. There's no reality to the Greek gods. We understand that to be so. And so from that standpoint, well, I'm not honoring Apollo. Apollo doesn't exist if I eat this. I'm not showing reverence to this being that has no substance. Well, that's knowledge. And that knowledge may be, in one sense, true, but there are other factors involved here. Apollo may not be gathering any honor from what you're doing. That's true, because he doesn't exist. But it's not just that knowledge that you need to consider. You also need to consider what he calls in the old translation charity. He says knowledge can puff up, it can inflate us, it can cause us to be proud. But he says charity will edify. It will build up others rather than damaging them in some way. Look in verse 7. You know these things to be so, howbeit, there is not in every man that knowledge. For some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol. And their conscience being weak is defiled. But meat commends us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. So there are several things to consider here, Paul says. Part of it is the reality that Christians are not under the dietary restrictions, for example, of the Old Testament. Let no man judge you in respect to meat any more than the new moon or the Sabbath day. Those are a shadow of things to come. The body is Christ, granted to be so. Eating of meat is not inherently sinful. But you've got to recognize this too, that we're not all on the same level of understanding about what's going on here. We are, in fact, our brother's keeper, and we are called to have a charitable spirit. The great lesson, it seems to me, these 3 chapters teach, in part, is this, that we have to be concerned not just about the effect of our actions on ourselves, but on others. He calls us to consider your brother's conscience, to consider your effect on your brother spiritually, and even on those who are not your brethren. What message do you send by what you do? It's not enough to say, well, I know. Well, you may know, but what you're not thinking about, Paul writes, is how this will affect others who may not know all you know. Now that, it seems to me, is a very practical point. In verse 9, take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them who are weak. For if any man see thee that which hast knowledge, sit at meat in an idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died? But when you sin so against the brethren, you wound their weak consciences. You sin against Christ. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world stands, lest I make my brother to offend. In this passage, Paul talks about those who are weak. We find that term used several times. What does he mean by that? I don't think that he's really thinking about that in the way we normally use the word. We're called to mind the passage in Romans chapter 14. There's some real differences, I think, between our text and Romans 14, and yet there are some obvious similarities. Romans chapter 14, Paul there is addressing this issue. He begins the chapter, him that is weak in faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. For one believeth he may eat all things, another, who is weak, eats herbs. Let not him that eats despise him that eats not, and let not him that eats not judge him that eats, for God hath received him. Who are you to judge another man's servant? To his own master he stands or falls, yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. One man esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regards the day regards it to the Lord. He that regards not the day to the Lord, he doth not regard it. He that eats, eats to the Lord. He that does not eat to the Lord. I believe the context in Romans 14 of the whole book goes back to the idea of Jew and Gentile. You know, he says the gospel is God's power to save to the Jew first and also to the Greek. In that context, he doesn't explain here in any detail. What could he mean when he talks about esteeming a day? What could he mean? Well, I think the Sabbath day obviously comes to mind. And so you have the picture of some brethren, perhaps new converts, who have come out of Judaism. They have grown up hearing over and again and themselves restrictively keeping a law that taught them you must not on the Sabbath day you must not engage in normal activity. It is to be a day in which there is no servile work to be done. Is that the law of Christ? No. But here's a brother who is troubled by that. And I think what Paul is saying in the passage is, do not make it your business to do things that will trouble this weak brother. He's weak. How is he weak? He's not weak in commitment. You know, sometimes we use that word, we say, we got brethren, and we have to beg them to come to church on Wednesday night. What's wrong with this picture? Why would I not want to be with the saints anytime I could physically be there? They won't read their Bible. Or maybe they won't pray like they ought to, or whatever. That's not the kind of weakness we're talking about here, is it? We're talking about a weakness that really is just a weakness in knowledge. They're fully committed, zealous to obey God, but they don't feel as sure about things as you do. They don't know all you know. Paul said, do not trouble their consciences. Do not force them, push them into areas where they feel uncomfortable, because these are not matters that are matters of law. If he doesn't want to do work on the Sabbath day, he's not going to hurt anybody doing that. So leave him alone, he says, in effect, in terms of your conduct. Don't push him into something that he would be condemned in his conscience for doing. The same was true about eating meats, I think. Probably the dietary laws will be what he has in mind here, although he doesn't specify. But that fits well the context. So we're talking, I think the same thing is true in some sense here. But I don't think here we're talking about keeping the old law that at one time was God's law. Now we're delving into other areas. Now we're living in a pagan world, and now we're concerned about being associated with pagan practices. I think there is a difference in those two things. Many of the phrases are the same, but I do think the circumstances are different and perhaps affects how we come out. So, Paul, back in the ninth verse, said, be careful lest your liberty be a stumbling block to them that are weak. You know certain things. Good. Glad you do. But don't get so caught up in what you know that you forget to consider how other brethren will be affected by what you do. What does it mean to be a stumbling block? One fellow defined this word this way. 1A definition would be a literal definition. That is, an obstacle in the way, which if one strikes his foot against, he stumbles or he falls. Somebody leaves a box in the aisle and I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing, I trip over it. That's a stumbling block. We all understand that. But then there's a moral aspect to this. That over which a soul stumbles, that is, which is caused to sin. So we see what Paul is talking about here. On the one hand, the Corinthians had their liberty. We're at liberty. Meats are to be received with thanksgiving. Isn't that what Paul taught? That's right. And the Greek and Roman gods are not real. They're not. All those things are true. But there are other factors here also. What about the consciences of weaker brethren? Those who have come out of idolatry and are just not going to be able to feel conscientiously good about involving themselves in certain activities, certainly in going to certain places. What about them? What about your influence as a Christian? You claim to be one who denies that these gods have any reality. And yet people see you sitting there he says in verse 10, I believe it is, see you sit in an idol's temple. We'll come back to that, I think, in the 10th chapter. But that's an extraordinary thing. We're not talking now just about, somebody buying food and you may not be sure where it came from. Now we're talking about going down and sitting down in the idol's temple because I think, after all, there's no such thing as Apollo or whoever it might be. Yeah, but you got to think about what that looks like. You got to think about the message that sends. You got to think about the implied fellowship that this situation creates. So, think about other factors. Think about your influence and think about the consciences of your brethren. And I think what Paul comes down to is this, that my rights do not outweigh the potential damage done to others, that souls might be lost. Look in chapter 8 and verse 11. In that case, if you go ahead because, well, I know, in that case your knowledge is ruining a believer whose faith is weak, a believer, by the way, for whom Christ died. You sure you want to answer for that? In Romans 14, again, a little different situation, but similar, Paul writes, coming to the same point, Romans 14:19, so then let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding, and do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. It is good not to eat meat or to drink wine or anything that causes your brother to stumble. So again, we come back to this point that we read in verse 13, and somebody decided to end a chapter there. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world stands, lest make my brother to offend. The idea of offense, again, is the idea of causing another to stumble. And so, it really raises this question to me and to you. Are we leading others to sin? Now, actually, there are a lot of ways we can lead people to sin. My misconduct, my laziness, my carelessness, my worldliness. There are a lot of ways in which we can have a bad influence on other people. That's all true. But what about in the realm of even our liberties? Are there things that might be liberties for us that would at the same time have a potential detrimental effect on other people? I'm not here to give you a full list of that. I'm just going to give you some similarities. He talks in this passage about eating meats. That meat bothered the conscience of some people at that time. I suppose that still could be true. There are people who may come out of religious backgrounds. I can think of Protestant denominations that are essentially vegetarian. Now here you have a fellow that you're trying to work with along that line, and you invite him over for dinner. And you have, pork roast. That's going to be a problem for him. And you sort of kid him and gig him into that. He's a new Christian. He's come out of that. You know better than that. You ought to just have some of this. In the way I handle that matter, I can really wound his conscience. I can cause him to do something that he believes to be sinful or at least questionable. He can't do it, as Paul would write in Romans 14, in faith and confidence. Whatever is not of faith or confidence, if you have a conscientious question and objection about the matter, but I'll do it anyway, that's sinful, Paul said. So I've taken a matter that was really a matter of liberty, and I have by my conduct and the choices that I've made tripped another brother up into sin. Now, we might use the example again of observing days, as Paul does in Romans 14. There are folks who may come out of a Protestant background. I think we've talked about this recently, where they've got it all twisted up in their mind, and I say this with kindness, that Sunday is the Christian Sabbath, and the Sabbath was a day of rest, so that means Sunday ought to be a day of rest, and you ought not to cut your grass on Sunday because that would violate God's law. Let me offer this thought about the Lord's Day. I do believe Sunday is the Lord's Day. And I don't believe it's just the Lord's hour. I believe it is the Lord's day. I think it is a special day. And I think it ought to be treated with specialness. I think it's a good thing that we meet together and not just have a minute and get out of here, but that we take a day in which we dedicate that day to God. Now, somebody might say, well, it's not the Sabbath, and I can cut my grass or do whatever it might be. Well, you can. If you can do that and do all the other things you need to do, that's not the point. But if there's a situation where somebody who sees you do that is pushed away from Christ, or maybe as a young Christian is encouraged to do something that they don't feel good about doing, then it becomes a problem. That's where Paul talks about liberties. Yes, liberties. But that's not the only concern we have. Charity moves us to think about how my actions might affect someone else. I thought about this as another example. I don't know how far-fetched it might be, but every once in a while you might be invited to come and to sit down in a meal at let's just make up a story here, that we have a friend of ours who passes, and after the funeral they say, come down to the, let's just use the Catholic Church as an example. Come down to the Catholic Church, we're going to have a big supper down here, or a big lunch here for those who come, and we'll commiserate together down there. And a fellow thinks about that, and he thinks, well, what kind of message am I going to be sending if I go? On the one hand, don't you preach that you ought to separate the Lord's money from social things, and churches ought not to have these? So yes, I do. I believe that. On the other hand, I might say, I don't think this is the Lord's money. I don't think it has anything to do with the Lord. With all kindness, I don't believe this is the Lord's money. So I have knowledge on the one hand, but I'm also concerned about a message that I might send on the other. And I'll have to decide, based on how both those things work, as to whether I need to do something here or not. I need to go or I need not to go. What kind of message will I be sending? Will it imply a fellowship with what this place stands for that I don't want to send? Paul would say, you can't just say, well, I know. You know. But it's more than just what you know. It's about what others will see and about how others might be affected by what we do. And that, I think, is a very practical and important principle that we're going to need to apply in many ways, on many occasions. I think tonight we want to take up in chapter 9 and look at how Paul applies these things in his own life, with his own conduct, sacrifices that he has made for the cause, and then calling upon all of us to have that same willingness to sacrifice for him. So we'll talk about 9, and I hope 10 tonight as we finish out this study. I appreciate your kind attention this morning. If you're here today and you're not a child of God, I hope that this reminder, though it's not been about how to enter the kingdom, it is a good reminder of this, that the life of a Christian is a life of selflessness. That we're not called just to come and get what we need and do what pleases us. No, far from it. Every Christian in this room knows we're called to serve others and serve God through serving others. That's why, we were talking about attendance a while ago. I mentioned it. That's why it's so misguided to me when people seem to make decisions based upon the idea, well, I don't have to go every time. I get enough. I don't have to go every time. It's not just about what we get. We might be fooled by that too, by the way. It's what we give. That coming together is not just an opportunity to get. It's an opportunity to give. To give our example, to give our word of encouragement, to raise our voice in song. And so, that's one thing that Paul reminds us of in this section, isn't it? It is developing the selfless mind. And he certainly had that in abundance. And we're going to start there, Lord willing, tonight. But that's what I've got to be. I've got to be somebody who comes to Christ and lays down my wants and wishes and my will to him. And then to take it up again with the idea in mind that I would serve others in his name. That's the work that we're called to do. And that sounds hard, and it is hard. And some of us have been at it a long time and haven't perfected it yet. But God has given me another day to try to do better. But I'll tell you this, it's really the way to happiness. Because if I live my whole life all about me, I don't know any sure way to misery than that. It may sound like that's the ideal way. It is not. Christ showed me the way. He gave himself for all of us. He wants us to come to him and then give ourselves for the betterment of others. If you'd like to start that journey, you can today. It comes by a funeral. It starts out by making our confession that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, is a penitent believer. We come and we're buried in baptism. And that old man is dead. And we're now risen to walk in newness of life. Be a great day to do that if you're here and you have that mindset. If you're here as one who is a child of God, but you've not lived as you should, you've not been faithful as you should, then make that right with him, please. And if we can help you in any way, let us know how right now, please, while we stand, while we sing.